Today's story is The Mr. Men Sports Day by Roger Hargreaves. Last summer, Mr. Happy had the most splendid idea. The more he thought about it, the happier he became, and the happier he became, the more he smiled. And, as you know, a Mr. Happy smile is a smile worth seeing. He went to see Mr. Uppity about his idea. Mr. Uppity was his usual rude self. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I was wondering," wondered Mr. Happy, "if we could have a Mr. Men's Sports Day," he smiled, "in your garden." Mr. Uppity has the biggest garden in the world. "No," said Mr. Uppity. "But," said Mr. Happy. "No," said Mr. Uppity. "Oh," said Mr. Happy, and went away, looking not quite so happy. He went to see Mr. Fussy about the sports day. "Well, can we have it in your garden?" he asked. Mr. Fussy's garden is so neat, worms aren't even allowed. "A sports day?" sniffed Mr. Fussy. "In my garden? Oh, goodness gracious me, no!" "Oh, why not?" asked Mr. Happy. "My grass," replied Mr. Fussy. "What about your grass?" asked Mr. Happy. "You'll bend it," said Mr. Fussy, "and there's one thing I can't stand, it's bent grass." Poor Mr. Happy went off. He met Mr. Forgetful and told him of his idea for a sports day. "Oh, splendid!" cried Mr. Forgetful. "Why don't we have it in one of Farmer Fields's fields?" Now, Farmer Fields was a friend of Mr. Forgetful. "Oh, yes," agreed Mr. Happy. "Will you go and ask him?" "This very minute," cried Mr. Forgetful, and rushed off. Farmer Fields was leaning on the gate, watching the grass grow, as farmers do. Can we borrow one of your fields?" asked Mr. Forgetful. "I would think so," replied the farmer. "What do you want it for?" Said Mr. Forgetful. Well," said Mr. Forgetful, "I've forgotten," he admitted. "Oh, Mr. Forgetful," laughed Farmer Fields, "you are one." Well, Mr. Forgetful thought and thought hard. "I know," he cried at last. "It's for a short spray." Farmer Fields scratched his head. "You want one of my fields for a short spray?" Well, luckily, Mr. Happy had followed Mr. Forgetful. "He means we want one of your fields," explained Mr. Happy, "for a sports day." "Ah, fine," said Farmer Fields. "When do you want it?" "Next Monday," replied Mr. Happy. "Right," said Farmer Fields. "Monday it is." "Monday what is?" asked Mr. Forgetful. "Oh, dear." Then Mr. Happy went to tell the other Mr. Men about their sports day. "A sports day on Mondays," said Mr. Greedy. And then he thought, "I trust that refreshments will be provided." "A sports day on Monday," cried Mr. Dizzy. "Oh, good." And then he thought, "What's a sports day?" he asked. "A Monday on sports day," cried Mr. Topsy-Turvy, getting things the wrong way round, as usual. "A sports day on Monday," said Mr. Lazy, opening one eye. "And what happens on a sports day?" "Oh, there'll be lots of running and jumping," laughed Mr. Happy. "Oh, no, there won't," replied Mr. Lazy. "Running and jumping don't agree with me." "A sports day on Monday," cried Mr. Muddle. Is that the day after Friday? Well, Monday was a beautiful day, and all the Mr. Men assembled in Farmer Fields's fields. Have you decided what to go in for? Mr. Tickle asked Mr. Lazy. Yes, replied Mr. Lazy. What? Asked Mr. Tickle. The 40 winks, murmured Mr. Lazy. Well, that Monday the Mr. Men had a wonderful sports day. Mr. Greedy was the first in the egg and spoon race. The only trouble was that he didn't have an egg on his spoon. Where's the egg? Asked Mr. Funny. Guess, replied Mr. Greedy, licking his lips. Well, Mr. Bump won the hop, step, and bump. And Mr. Bounce won the high jump easily. And Mr. Silly decided that he would go in for the low jump. And after that, they had a tug of war. The Mr. Men pulled and tugged and tugged and pulled as hard as ever as they could. But it was no use, because guess who they were tugging against? Oh, Mr. Strong! Last of all was the race. All the Mr. Men lined up. Ready, steady, go! Shouted Mr. Topsy-Turvy, and off they set. I'm winning, shouted Mr. Muddle, running as fast as his legs would carry him. But there was only one problem. Mr. Muddle was running in the opposite direction to all the other Mr. Men. And of all the Mr. Men who were running in the right direction, it was Mr. Jelly who came first. And do you know why? Because just before the race started, a worm poked his head out of the ground behind Mr. Jelly and said, "Boo!" And little things like that frightened Mr. Jelly a lot. "Run for your lives!" he cried in terror. And that's how he came to be running faster than anyone else. And then it was all over. "We must do this again next year," boomed Mr. Noisy, very noisily. Mr. Forgetful looked rather puzzled. "Do what again?" he asked. The end.